As day 3 of the hearing began on December 27th, the usual expectant crowd at the Shadwell public office awaited Williams's arrival, but they were instead met by a prison guard who informed everyone that Williams had been found dead. Using his handkerchief, he had hanged himself from an iron clothesline in his cell. They were told that when the prison guard said goodnight to him the night before, he was seen to be cheerful and said he was hopeful of an early release. In the eyes of most, Williams having taken his own life was the last act of a guilty man. It seemed that the only thing left to do was to prove this posthumously, and the order was given for the hearing to go ahead. The evidence they had against Williams so far is as follows. He lodged at the pear tree, where he had access to a chest of tools. A maul from that chest had been identified as the murder weapon in the Marr murders. He had arrived home well after midnight on the night of the Marr murders. He drank at the King's Arms and admitted to being there on the night of the Williamsons' murders. He was known to be poor, but was found to have silver which he said he got from pawning his clothes. Mrs. Rice, his laundress, had washed a lightly blood-stained shirt belonging to him, which Williams said was worn during a fight. Then there was Mrs. Orr's story possibly linking Williams to another chisel, taken from the same toolbox as the murder weapon. Mrs. Vermillow, when called to the stand, had some new information. She had found a pair of muddy stockings belonging to Williams with 2 marks, which looked like blood near the waistline. When asked why she hadn't mentioned this before, she exclaimed that she was afraid that Williams would kill her if he found out she tried to implicate him in the murders. Her concerns may have been genuine, but it's also possible that she was more worried about the pear tree's reputation if people thought they had been harbouring a killer, or if the law thought they had. She and her husband may lose out on the reward money. She then said that she had heard from a friend of Williams that his real name was John Murphy. This supported a theory that John Williams was the lame Irishman seen running along New Gravel Lane, and the name Murphy may have been mistaken for Mahoney. A woman named Miss Lawrence was a barmaid at the Royal Oak, the same place Williams had claimed he'd been in a fight. When called to the stand, she said that she was positive that there had been no fight, simply a verbal argument between Williams and a group of coal heavers. This went some way to discrediting Williams' explanation for the blood-stained shirt. John Harrison, Williams's roommate, was called next. He said that he had gone to the pear tree and spoke to Mrs. Vermillow regarding the Marr murders on the morning after they had happened. He then went upstairs to tell Williams, who was in bed. He said that Williams simply replied, "I know of it." Harrison said he'd wondered how he'd known, seeing that he had not yet left the premises that day. Harrison did acknowledge, however, that Williams may have simply overheard the conversation downstairs between himself and Mrs. Vermillow. Finally, he told the magistrate that he had seen a pair of muddy shoes beneath Williams's bed on the day after the King's Arms murders. These shoes, cleaned by now, were examined, but there is no mention of a match to either of the prints found at the 2 murder scenes. Next, Williams's second roommate, John Cuthbertson, gave details of a conversation he had had with him after the Marr murders. He had suggested that Williams visit a surgeon to ease the pain in his injured leg. Williams replied, "It is of no consequence. The gallows will get hold of me soon." So during the last day of the hearing, some new and damaging claims were made. But why hadn't these details, if true, been brought to the attention of the magistrates before? Were these people trying to falsely incriminate Williams now that he was dead and could not defend himself? In the face of this damning evidence, a man named John Fitzpatrick stepped forward and provided something of an alibi for Williams for the night of the King's Arms murders. He said that they had both been drinking at the Ship and Royal public house, parting ways at 11:15, which is almost exactly when the murders were taking place. As with the previous claims, this could have also been a lie if Fitzpatrick was trying to protect his friend, or indeed both of them. It was at this point that a man who should have been featured far more heavily in the investigation and been scrutinised a great deal more than he was came forward. William Ablis, known locally as Long Billy, had a number of links to both murder cases. He was another seaman and had sailed alongside both John Williams and Timothy Marr on board the Roxburgh Castle. He was seen drinking in the company of Williams on the night of the King's Arms murders. Being 6 foot tall and heavily built, he was a far better physical match for John Turner's description of the, quote, tall man, and one of his legs was also lame. He was unable to account for all of his time on the nights of both crimes, but said that he had parted ways with Williams between 8 and 9 on the night in question, returning home and remaining there for the rest of the evening. This was corroborated by his landlady and a fellow lodger who said that they had both seen him when the murders happened. It was later suggested, as Ablis had sailed with both Williams and Marr, that maybe there had been some disagreement between the three, old scores to settle. But by now the magistrates had seen enough, and no more was asked of Ablis. The police were no doubt hoping to put the episode behind them after nearly 4 weeks and hours of interrogation time. There was no time to look back, weigh up evidence and take stock. The prime suspect had apparently taken his own life, and this was now being treated as an indirect admission of guilt. The feelings expressed by the magistrates on Boxing Day that there may not be enough evidence to prove William's guilt had vanished. Following the hearing, they wrote to the Home Secretary again. "We think it our duty to inform you that what appeared in evidence previously to the death of Williams, together with what has appeared on a very full examination this morning, that Williams was the perpetrator of the late murders in the neighbourhood, and we have also to add that we have every reason to hope that he alone was concerned." But many questions still lingered despite the 3-day hearing. John Turner's description of a tall man at the King's Arms could hardly have fitted Williams, who was only 5'9". William's blood-stained shirt was thought to be significant, but if he had taken part in such brutality, wouldn't there have been far more blood present? Even though he claimed to have visited 2 surgeons on the night of the Williamson murders before heading west to other public houses, his post-midnight arrival home was considered suspicious. If he had committed a murder, surely he would have gone home straight afterwards, rather than risk detection out in the open. The pear tree was a 5-minute walk from the King's Arms, so he would have been back long before midnight, and there was no attempt by the police, as far as I can see, to contact either surgeon. The route the killers were assumed to have taken over the wastelands behind the King's Arms was in the opposite direction to where the 2 running men were seen by Henry Johnson, although it's possible that, if they were the murderers, they were unable to clear the clay bank and returned to the road to make their escape. It may be significant that Williams pawned his shoes the day after the Marr murders, considering the footprint left at the scene. There is no mention of efforts by the police to trace these shoes. More central mysteries appear to be ignored at this stage. It's unlikely, for example, that one person worked alone, given that multiple attacks were made in a short period of time. Mr. Williamson of the King's Arms was a large man, so it's difficult to believe that someone of William's stature could have taken him down alone, along with his wife and servant. This is where William Ablis is a far better fit as a suspect. He was a larger man at 6 foot, he had a history of violence, and once headed a mutiny at sea, so it can be assumed that he was far more experienced in combat. It was suggested that Williams was Irish, not Scottish, as he had claimed. If true, this dishonesty could have been the result of the local attitude towards the Irish, but it raised particular interest because of the lame Mahoney character reportedly seen on New Gravel Lane on the night of the Williamson murders. Then of course there was Williams's apparent suicide. It's possible that it wasn't a suicide at all. Maybe the hanging had been forced by an emotional prison guard or someone who was involved in the crimes. If it was suicide, maybe Williams had lost all hope, given the amount of so-called evidence against him, but his reported jovial mood and optimism the night before suggests otherwise. Of course, there is the possibility that he was guilty, or at least involved, and wanted to elude a public shaming and the hangman. The inquest into Williams's death was quickly carried out at Coldbath Fields Prison, again overseen by coroner John Unwin. Prisoners Francis Knott and Henry Harris were called to cut Williams down after a guard had found him hanging at 7:30 a.m. on December 27th. Surgeon Thomas Webb, who inspected the body, said that there were abrasion marks all around Williams's neck, where the handkerchief was still tied. There were no other injuries on the body, and he had been dead for some time. The term cheated the gallows was used in reference to criminals who committed suicide whilst in custody. It was seen as an insult to the law and the community if a prisoner decided to take their own private fate to elude public execution. As Williams had avoided a public hanging which would have taken place at Newgate Prison, it was decided that an alternative ceremony would take place. The old custom was that if a prisoner committed suicide prior to being executed, they would be interred at a crossroads close to where the crimes had taken place, after being paraded around the town. This sometimes involved having a stake run through the body moments before burial. The belief was that if a stake is run through the body, it would prevent the evil spirit of the dead returning to earth. If the malevolent spirit escaped the impaling stake, then he or she would forever hesitate at the four roads, never knowing which way to turn. But even in 1811 this tradition was becoming less popular and was considered by some to be an old-fashioned superstition. The last reported Crossroad burial of a suicide victim took place in 1823, when a man named Abel Griffiths was buried at a crossroads in Westminster. Shadwell was the agreed location for Williams's burial, and on Monday, December 30th at 10 p.m, a High Constable named Robinson, along with his deputy and two other lawmen, went to Coldbath Fields Prison to fetch the body of Williams. He was placed in a hackney carriage, and it was the deputy constable's misfortune to travel alone with the corpse, while the other three men travelled in a separate coach. The coaches came to a halt at the bottom of Ship Alley, by the watch house of St George's, where William's body was cast into what is only described as the Black Hold, where it remained until the next morning. On New Year's Eve morning, the High Constable returned to Ship Alley with the parade of men. They placed Williams's body on a wooden board on the back of a cart. The board was placed at an incline to allow the masses to view the dead man's face. The murder weapon was placed just above his head to the left, and one of the ripping chisels linked to Williams was placed opposite. The iron crowbar used in the King's Arms murders was placed directly above his head, along with the stake intended for Williams himself. A cord fastened the body to the board, and a wooden beam was placed below the feet for support. It was reported that Williams's face was fresh-looking, completely clear of discoloration, but his arms were almost black from the elbows down. At 10:30 a.m. they proceeded along Ship Alley. The procession included a number of police constables, officers and other respected men in the community, including a coal merchant, a baker and a ship's captain. Many in authority had feared that the sight of Williams's corpse, once out on the busy streets, might incite a mob to seize the body, but the atmosphere was calm. Crowds looked on in relative silence as the named murderer was paraded through the streets, passing the public houses and inns that he had once frequented during his short time there. As the procession moved slowly along Ratcliffe Highway, they stopped outside the Marr family linen shop. One of the men from the procession climbed up and tilted Williams's head so that his dead eyes were now directed on the now empty linen shop. After a few minutes, the cart was led down Old Gravel Lane, passing the London Dock Wall by the Thames, onto Cinnamon Street, and from there to Pear Tree Alley, where it stopped briefly outside the pear tree where Williams had once lived. The cart was then led back up Cinnamon Street, along King Edward Street, along Wapping and up Gravel Lane, where it stopped again outside the scene of the second massacre, the King's Arms. A hackney coach then pulled up next to the cart, and from it a man emerged with a whip in his hand. He delivered 3 lashes to the face of Williams before the procession moved back onto Ratcliffe Highway and up Cannon Street towards its final stop. The cart ground to a halt at the crossroads of Cannon Street and Cable Street, also known as Back Lane. Here a hole 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide and 2 feet long had been dug, deliberately too small for the body to fit into easily. The corpse was then taken from the cart and forced into the hole. The wooden stake and the maul were taken from the cart. The stake was then hammered through the heart of Williams to a sudden chorus of cheers, yells and curses from the crowd. Unslaked lime was then thrown on top of the body, and the hole was filled with earth. It was estimated that 10,000 people took to the street to witness the spectacle. To some, the ceremony was a dreadful result of archaic superstition, but to the majority who stood by the word of the law, justice was done, and they could finally rest more easily in their beds. Crowds filled the streets for most of the day, as people came and went from the crossroads to view the unchristian burial ground that lay in the shadow of the Dolphin public house. As night fell and a new year dawned on Shadwell, the crowds slowly dispersed. Today, the final resting place of John Williams is as common a sight as you'll find in any British inner city. As the years went by following the events of 1811, and the people linked to them passed away, the story of where John Williams was laid to rest became somewhat of an urban legend, and people began to wonder whether or not the story of the dead man at the Crossroads was true. That was until 1886, when a gas company began to excavate this area to dig a trench. In the middle of the crossroad and 6 feet below the road's surface was a skeleton, reportedly buried upside down, with the remains of a wooden stake through its torso. Actor H.B. Irving and scholar John Churton Collins, both with an interest in criminology, were allowed to examine the remains and took away the bones of the right arm. The landlord of the newly named Crown and Dolphin public house, which stands on the corner of Cannon Street Road, is said to have kept the skull. Although the building still bears the Crown and Dolphin name to this day, the pub itself closed in 1992 and was converted into flats. The current whereabouts of John Williams's skull, along with the rest of his remains, are unknown. To most of the population of Shadwell and Wapping, the horrible events of 1811 were over and done with. But within the police force, there were still efforts to bring a second killer to justice. The first issue at hand was the apparently light examination of Cornelius Hart in December. Mrs. Vermillow of the Pear Tree had complained, saying that if Hart had been examined to the same extent that she was, far more information would have been uncovered. Apparently on the back of this statement alone, Hart was investigated again. 4 interesting new pieces of information came from this. Firstly, Hart had said that the last time he saw Timothy Marr was on the night of Friday, December 6, 1811, the night before the murders. However, during his January investigation, an unnamed woman told police that she had seen him at the linen drapers at 9 p.m. on the night of the murders. If her story is to be believed, and let's not forget there were still people hoping to receive a great deal of reward money, then Cornelius Hart had lied for a second time. Secondly, the woman went on to say that Hart had a large bag with him, which made police wonder if it contained them all. Had Hart brought it into the building himself with the intention of leaving it there for either himself or someone else to use later that night? Police thought it possible, but Marr could easily have moved the bag to another room before the killers arrived, leaving them without an intended weapon. Thirdly, Hart had always claimed that on the Sunday after the Marr murders he had not left his home until late in the evening, but it was reported that 2, quote, respectable witnesses had seen him on Ratcliffe Highway at 10 a.m. Finally, Hart had told police in December that he had been at work on the Monday following the Marr murders. Although his true whereabouts were never ascertained, his employer swore that Hart was not at work that day. This new information, however, was not enough to put Hart under any serious suspicion. His home was searched though, but nothing was found, and he was released. The most interesting piece of information during this late investigation came from John Williams's roommate John Harrison. Harrison said that Williams had borrowed a handkerchief from him. When Harrison asked for it back, Williams told him to fetch it from the inside pocket of his blue jacket. Harrison claimed that when he did, he found a 6-inch knife with an ivory handle in the pocket, which was stained with blood. This story, as unreliable as it seemed, was treated as definite evidence that this was the weapon used to cut the throats of the victims, even going against the professional opinion of the coroner, who said that nothing less than a razor blade could have made the incisions. The Times, among other papers, wrote, "It is now, however, pretty clear that these sanguinary deeds were perpetrated with the knife in question." It was at this point, inconceivably, that the Shadwell magistrates finally ordered a search of Williams's former living quarters at the Pear Tree. It was during the second of 2 searches that the police found an old jacket, the inside pocket of which was stiff with dried blood. Then, behind a small closet, they found a small cavity in the wall. Inside they found a 6-inch knife, lightly stained with what looked like blood, with an ivory handle. It matched perfectly the description given by John Harrison. The discovery of the jacket with the bloody pocket suggested to police that Williams was the man seen by John Turner at the King's Arms, rifling through the pockets of Mrs. Williamson and placing a bloody hand in his inside pocket. When John Harrison was asked why he hadn't brought this to the attention of the magistrates during the hearing, he replied that he did not think it important at the time. In mid-January, issues surrounding the handling of the Ratcliffe Highway murders were raised in the Houses of Parliament. Williams's suicide, it was felt, could have been avoided. The fact that he was left in a cell for hours with a handkerchief large enough to hang himself with along with items of clothing he could just have easily used, was brought to attention. The Speaker, Richard Sheridan, even jokingly asked why prison guards did not supply inmates with a nightly supply of razors and pistols. A great deal of blame fell on the Shadwell magistrates for allowing police officers to contain men simply on the grounds of reputation, nationality or appearance. The fact that Williams's lodgings were not searched until 3 weeks after suspicion fell on him was also criticised. The handling of the case didn't do as much for public confidence in the police as maybe they had hoped. In their December 21st edition, the Morning Post wrote, "Respectable householders must determine to be their own guardians, by alternately patrolling streets they respectively inhabit, or we must regularly enlist armed police, under orders of proper officers." Prime Minister Spencer Perceval defended the deployment of night watchmen during December of 1811 by saying no state of nightly watch, however excellent, could have prevented such a crime. Little more than 3 months later, Spencer Perceval may have, for a moment, regretted this disregard. A sea merchant named John Bellingham, who had been imprisoned in Russia over a disputed unpaid debt there, had recently been released and was seeking compensation from the British government. His pleas were ignored, and on May 11, 1812, Bellingham entered the lobby of the House of Commons and shot Prime Minister Perceval in the chest. Perceval's last words were reported to have been, "Murder. Oh my God."